Cole had spent years surviving in the wild, but nothing had prepared him for this, the massive grizzly, trapped on a collapsing bridge, fighting for its life. With his heart pounding, Cole knew he had a choice: walk away or risk everything to save the beast. The Santa Fe Mountains stretched endlessly before Cole, their peaks crowned with a brilliant blue sky. The air was crisp, carrying the fresh scent of pine and damp earth. He had waited months for this, an escape into the wilderness, far from the chaos of city life. Out here, there were no ringing phones, no honking cars, no endless emails. Just him, the towering trees, and the open sky. He had always felt drawn to the wild, to places untouched by human hands. This trip was something he had meticulously planned: 7 days of solitude, carrying only the essentials. His backpack was packed with camping gear, dehydrated meals, a sturdy tent, and his most trusted survival tools. A week of self-reliance, a chance to test his skills and reconnect with nature. The first day had gone smoothly. Cole had set up camp near a bubbling creek, enjoying the quiet as he cooked a simple meal over his small camping stove. The night had been peaceful, the stars stretching infinitely above him, each one a tiny reminder of how vast the world truly was. He slept deeply, lulled by the sounds of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the wind. On the second morning, he woke early, packed up his gear, and set out deeper into the mountains. The trail grew rugged, winding through massive rock formations that burned red in the morning sun. Occasionally, he spotted animal tracks in the dirt: deer, rabbits, the occasional paw print of something larger. He carried Grizzly spray on his belt, a precaution, though he hoped never to need it. By midday, the sun had risen high, and the air had grown warmer. He paused to drink from his canteen, wiping the sweat from his brow as he admired the view. The valley below was a breathtaking expanse of green and gold, stretching as far as his eyes could see. He was alone out here, truly alone, and he revelled in the feeling. As he continued onward, the path narrowed, leading him toward a canyon. The terrain was treacherous, loose gravel shifting beneath his boots. He moved carefully, placing each step with precision. Then a sound stopped him in his tracks. A low, strained growl almost drowned out by the wind. He froze, his pulse quickening. The sound came again, this time clearer. Not the deep, guttural growl of aggression, but something weaker, something desperate. He followed the noise, stepping cautiously toward the edge of the canyon. Peering over, his breath caught in his throat. A massive grizzly was clinging to the rocky ledge, its body half suspended over the drop. Its claws scraped against the stone, struggling for a grip, its hind legs trembling with the effort. It was clear the animal had slipped, perhaps while traversing the rocky terrain, and now it hung precariously above the sheer drop below. If it fell, it would plummet into the river far below, its fate all but sealed. Cole's instincts screamed at him to back away. This was a wild animal, one of the most powerful predators in North America. But as he locked eyes with the grizzly, something unexpected happened. He saw not rage, not aggression, but fear. A raw, primal fear, the same any creature would feel when faced with death. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Cole acted, his body moving before his mind could stop him. He reached for the rope in his pack, but the moment he uncoiled it, reality hit him. There was no way he could pull the grizzly up. The sheer weight of the animal would be impossible to manage, even if he had something to anchor himself with. He needed another way. Scanning the area, his eyes landed on a fallen tree trunk, thick and sturdy, lying not far from the cliff's edge. An idea formed. He rushed over, grabbing a large branch and using it to pry the trunk forward. It was heavy, but with effort, he managed to maneuver it closer to the ledge, angling it so it formed a bridge between the cliff and the spot where the grizzly clung. Sweat dripped down his face as he reinforced the makeshift bridge with smaller branches, wedging them into the cracks between the rocks. It wasn't perfect, but it might just work. He stepped back and whistled, trying to get the grizzly's attention. The grizzly turned its massive head, eyes flicking toward the trunk. It hesitated, its muscles still trembling from exhaustion. Cole knew this was a gamble if the grizzly panicked. It could lose its grip entirely. He knelt slightly, keeping his posture low and unthreatening. The grizzly exhaled heavily, then slowly, carefully shifted its weight. One massive paw reached forward, testing the stability of the trunk. Cole held his breath. Another paw followed. The grizzly's body trembled with exertion, but it kept moving, inching forward one step at a time. The bridge creaked under its weight, but it held. With one final push, the grizzly pulled itself up, its body finally reaching solid ground. Cole instinctively stepped back, his pulse racing. Now that the grizzly was safe, he realized the very real danger he was in. If the animal decided he was a threat, it could tear him apart in seconds. The grizzly stood there, sides heaving, its large paws pressing into the dirt. For a moment, Cole thought it might charge, but then something strange happened. The grizzly took a step closer. Cole remained perfectly still, his muscles tense, ready to run if he had to. But the grizzly didn't bare its teeth. It didn't growl. Instead, it lowered its massive head and nudged his outstretched hand with its nose just once. A brief, almost hesitant touch. Cole's breath hitched. He could feel the grizzly's warm breath against his skin, the coarse texture of its fur brushing against his fingers. It was a fleeting moment, a gesture that should have been impossible, yet here it was. Then, just as quickly as it had happened, the grizzly turned and lumbered away, disappearing into the trees without a sound. Cole stood there, heart pounding, staring at the empty space where the animal had been. Had that really just happened? Had a wild grizzly bear just thanked him? His legs felt weak beneath him, and he sat down hard on the ground, still trying to process what he had just experienced. He had expected danger, maybe even death, but instead he had shared something inexplicable, something profound. For the first time in his life, he felt something deeper than just admiration for the wilderness. He felt a connection as if, just for a moment, he had bridged the divide between man and nature. As he finally gathered his things and continued down the trail, he found himself looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see the grizzly watching him from the trees. He smiled to himself. Maybe, just maybe, it would remember him too. The morning air was crisp as Cole pressed forward, his boots crunching softly against the damp earth. The sun had just begun its slow ascent, casting golden light over the towering pines that framed his path. The wilderness stretched out endlessly before him, a vast, untamed world where man was merely a visitor. Yet, despite the rawness of the land, he felt at peace. More than Thaith felt a quiet exhilaration, as if he had been accepted, if only for a little while, into the rhythm of nature itself. His mind kept circling back to the events of the previous day, the grizzly, the impossible moment when it had nudged his hand before disappearing into the trees. He had read about animals showing signs of intelligence, of loyalty even, but he had never imagined he would witness it firsthand. Could wild animals recognize kindness? Could they remember those who had helped them? He shook his head, as if to clear the thought from his mind, but it lingered like a shadow. He had spent his life fascinated by the natural world, but something about that moment had changed him. There was something deeply humbling about it, a reminder that the world was not as simple as humans often believed. The day stretched on as he wove through dense foliage, the scent of damp earth and pine filling his senses. Occasionally, he paused to observe the wildlife that crossed his path. A group of deer lifted their heads as he approached, their large, dark eyes watching him warily before bounding off into the trees. Overhead, a bald eagle soared effortlessly through the sky, its wings outstretched as it scanned the ground below. He crossed several small streams, the cold water rushing over the smooth stones beneath his feet. He filled his canteen and washed his face, savoring the icy shock against his skin. Out here, everything felt real. stripped of the distractions and complications of modern life. There was no noise beyond the rustling of leaves, no artificial light beyond the sun filtering through the branches. As the day wore on, he began searching for a suitable place to set up camp. He preferred to sleep near a water source, and by late afternoon he found the perfect spotter serene riverbank, its waters flowing lazily through the valley. The area was clear of dense brush, offering an unobstructed view of the landscape around him. He dropped his pack and stretched, feeling the weight of the day settle into his muscles. He set up his tent with practiced efficiency, driving stakes into the ground and rolling out his sleeping bag inside. Once everything was in place, he gathered wood for a fire, stacking the dry branches into a neat pile. By the time the sun began its slow descent, the fire crackled warmly beside him, casting flickering shadows against the trees. Cole ate a simple dinner canned meat and bread, enjoying the rhythmic sound of the river beside him. He leaned back against a fallen log, staring up at the sky as the first stars began to appear. The peace of the wilderness settled around him like a familiar embrace. But as night deepened, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a change so small he barely noticed it. The usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of nocturnal creatures began to fade. The stillness that followed was unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He straightened, his senses sharpening. A distant sound echoed through the trees, a low, mournful howl carried by the wind. Wolves. Cole exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. Wolves weren't uncommon in these mountains, but they typically avoided humans. As long as he kept his fire going and didn't leave any food scraps out, he had nothing to worry about. He stirred the fire, adding another log to keep the flames bright. The howling came again, this time closer. A prickle of unease crawled up his spine. Still, he told himself there was no reason to panic. He had been in the wilderness enough times to know that predators were rarely interested in humans unless provoked. But as the minutes stretched on, the howls grew more frequent, closer. He turned his gaze toward the darkness beyond the fire's glow, and that's when he saw them. Glowing green eyes. Dozens of them, hovering just beyond the trees, reflecting the firelight like eerie lanterns. His breath hitched. The pack was closer than he had realized, watching, waiting. Then they moved. 7 wolves emerged from the shadows, stepping into the open with slow, deliberate movements. They were lean, their ribs faintly visible beneath thick fur. Hunger gleamed in their eyes. Cole's stomach twisted. This wasn't normal behavior. Wolves were opportunistic, but they rarely approached humans unless food was scarcer, unless they were desperate. He remained still, his mind racing. Running wasn't an option. If he fled, they would chase. His only defense was the fire. He grabbed a long stick and thrust it into the flames, pulling it out when the tip glowed red-hot. He lifted it high, hoping to intimidate them. The wolves hesitated, their ears flattening slightly. But they didn't retreat. One of them, slightly larger than the rest, took a step forward. Its lips curled, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. The others followed, forming a slow-moving circle around him. Cole's pulse pounded in his ears. He knew he had to act fast. The fire was his only weapon, but it was small, too small. He needed it bigger. He needed it stronger. Grabbing a handful of dry twigs, he tossed them onto the flames, trying to coax them higher. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air, but the wind worked against him, making it flicker weakly. The largest wolf growled low in its throat, then took another step forward. Cole gripped the flaming stick tighter, bracing himself. The wolves weren't afraid. They were testing him, and he was running out of options. A snarl tore through the silence as the lead wolf crouched low, its muscles tensed, preparing to strike. Cole's grip on the burning stick tightened, his pulse hammering as he tried to think of a way out. He knew he stood no chance in a fight. 7 wolves, hungry and desperate, closing in from all sides. His fire was weak, barely enough to cast flickering shadows against the trees. The wind had robbed him of his best defense, and now the pack knew it. Then, just as the lead wolf sprang forward, a deafening roar shattered the night. It came from the darkness behind the wolves, a sound so powerful, so primal, that the entire forest seemed to shudder in response. The wolves froze. Their ears flattened, and their heads snapped toward the trees, their growls faltering into wary whimpers. Cole's breath caught as he saw a massive shape emerge from the shadows. The grizzly. The very same grizzly he had saved days ago, standing at the edge of the firelight, its enormous form casting a monstrous silhouette against the trees. Its fur bristled, thick muscles shifting beneath its hide as it exhaled another earth-shaking roar, its teeth bared in a fearsome display. Cole was too stunned to move. It was impossible. The grizzly should have been miles away by now. There was no logical reason why it would be here. But it was. And it wasn't here to attack him. The wolves hesitated for only a moment before their leader, the largest of the pack, turned back toward Cole. It bared its teeth, refusing to back down so easily. The others followed its lead, growling, testing their odds. 7 against 1. They had numbers. The grizzly stepped forward. With terrifying speed, it lunged at the nearest wolf, swiping out with one massive paw. The wolf barely had time to react before the impact sent it flying, its body slamming into the dirt with a sharp yelp. It scrambled up, dazed, then bolted into the trees, limping as it vanished into the darkness. The rest of the pack tensed. Cole could see the conflict in their stance. The grizzly was huge, far stronger than any single wolf, but they still had numbers. For a moment, it seemed like they might risk the fight anyway. Then the grizzly reared up. Its full height was monstrous, towering over everything, its eyes gleaming with fury. It slammed its front paws back down, sending tremors through the ground, the force of it rattling through Cole's bone. The wolves faltered. Another growl rumbled from the grizzly's chest, low and menacing, as it took another step forward. The leader of the pack let out a snarl, but this time it was different, uncertain. A moment later, it let out a short, sharp bark. A signal. The wolves began to back away. One by one they turned, retreating into the trees. Their glowing eyes flickered in the darkness, lingering for a few seconds longer before disappearing entirely. The grizzly watched them go, its massive head swiveling, making sure they were truly gone. Only then did it relax. Cole let out a shaky breath, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. His entire body was buzzing with adrenaline, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The grizzly had saved him. Not by accident, not because it had simply wandered into the wrong place at the right time. It had protected him. On purpose. Cole swallowed hard, his eyes locked on the creature. It turned its head toward him, its deep brown eyes calm now, no longer wild with fury. For the first time since it had emerged from the trees, Cole saw no aggression in its face, only something eerily close to recognition. The silence stretched between them, the fire crackling weakly in the background. Cole's instincts screamed at him to be afraid. He had spent years learning about wildlife, understanding the dangers of predators. And yet he felt none of the usual fear that should have come with standing this close to a grizzly. Slowly, hesitantly, he took a step forward. The grizzly did not move. He swallowed, his throat dry, and knelt slightly, lowering himself to the ground not in submission, but in trust. The same way he had done days ago when he had tried to calm it at the edge of the cliff. The grizzly exhaled deeply, its breath misting in the cold night air. Then, just as it had before, it took a step closer. Cole didn't move as the grizzly extended its broad nose, pressing it lightly against his shoulder. The touch was brief, no more than a second, but it was enough. A quiet confirmation of something neither of them fully understood. Then the grizzly turned. Without another sound, it lumbered away, vanishing into the trees just as silently as it had come. Cole remained kneeling, his hands clenched into the dirt, his mind racing. This wasn't just an encounter. This was a bond. A wild grizzly bear had not only remembered him, it had returned the favor. It had come back, against all odds, to protect him the way he had once protected it. For a long time he didn't move. He simply sat there, staring into the woods, feeling the weight of what had just happened. Somewhere, deep in his soul, he knew he would never experience anything like this again, and that somehow this grizzly would always be a part of him. Cole lay awake in his tent, staring at the thin fabric above him, listening to the steady hum of the river nearby. His body ached with exhaustion, but his mind refused to rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, those glowing green eyes, the snarling jaws, the tense circle of wolves closing in. And then, just as vivid, the moment the grizzly emerged from the darkness, its thunderous roar breaking through the night, scattering the pack like dry leaves in the wind. It didn't make sense. Animals didn't just do that. He turned onto his side, trying to shake the thought away, but it clung to him, demanding to be understood. He had read about animals displaying intelligence, even loyalty, but he had never expected to witness it firsthand. Could the grizzly have truly recognized him? Could it have remembered that moment at the cliff and somehow returned the favor? The idea was almost too wild to believe. And yet, it had happened. The air inside the tent felt suffocating, and he sat up abruptly, running a hand over his face. He needed to breathe, needed to clear his head. Pushing open the tent flap, he stepped outside, letting the cold night air wash over him. The fire had died down to embers, a faint glow flickering in the darkness. Beyond it, the forest stretched out in silent, endless shadows. Somewhere out there, the grizzly was walking beneath the same sky. Cole exhaled slowly, staring out at the trees. He had come here searching for adventure, for a chance to disconnect from the world. Instead, he had found something far greater, something he couldn't fully explain. By the time the first streaks of dawn touched the horizon, he had made his decision. His trip was over. He had seen all he needed to see. The mountains had given him something rare, something that felt sacred, and he knew there was no reason to push his luck further. As the golden morning light filtered through the branches, he packed his things with quiet efficiency, rolling up his tent and securing his gear. The weight of his pack felt different now, lighter somehow, as if something fundamental within him had shifted. The journey back through the forest was slow, his footsteps deliberate. Everything around him felt more alive, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of birds, the wind whispering through the pines. He found himself pausing often, simply taking it all in. He had spent years hiking through wilderness like this, but never before had he felt so deeply aware of its presence. After hours of trekking, he finally reached the winding dirt road that led back towards civilization. A small roadside cafe sat nestled between the trees, a welcome sight after days in the wilderness. His stomach grumbled, reminding him just how little he had eaten the night before. Stepping inside, he was met with the comforting smell of fresh coffee and bacon sizzling on a grill. A handful of locals sat scattered throughout the space, their conversations low and unhurried. He dropped his pack by an empty chair and ordered a hot meal, grateful for the warmth of the cafe after the chill of the mountains. As he ate, he found himself telling the story. It started simply, enough a passing mention of the wolves, the danger he had faced, but as he spoke, the words kept coming, unfolding the events of the past few days like a story that wasn't entirely his own. The cliff, the grizzly, the impossible moment of connection. By the time he finished, the cafe had grown quieter. People listened with wide eyes, their expressions a mix of awe and disbelief. One man let out a low whistle, shaking his head.
You're lucky to be alive. Wolves don't usually go after people, but when they're hungry enough...
He trailed off, his meaning clear. A woman near the counter folded her arms.
And the grizzly just walked away after that? Didn't try to attack you?
Cole nodded.
It looked at me. Then it just turned and left.
Silence settled over the group, a thick pause that carried the weight of something unspoken. Then, from the far side of the cafe, an older man cleared his throat. His skin was weathered from years of sun, deep lines tracing his face like a map of time spent in these mountains. He leaned back in his chair, studying Cole with sharp, knowing eyes.
"You're not the first to have a story like that, and you won't be the last,"
the old man said. His voice was rough, slow, like the creaking of old timber. Cole frowned.
What do you mean?
The man took a sip of his coffee before setting the mug down with a quiet thud.
"Grizzlies are smarter than most folks think. They remember things. Some say they even recognize faces."
He paused, tapping his fingers against the table.
There have been stories people who've helped a grizzly, and later, that same grizzly shows up again. Not to attack, not to hurt, just to watch, to return the favor.
A chill ran down Cole's spine. The old man's gaze didn't waver.
Doesn't happen often. But when it does, well, it sticks with you.
Cole exhaled, leaning back in his seat. It wasn't a definitive answer. There was no way to prove what had happened, no logical explanation for why the grizzly had come back. But maybe logic wasn't the point. Maybe some things weren't meant to be fully understood. He finished his meal in quiet contemplation, thanking the cafe owner before stepping back outside. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the mountains rising in the distance like silent giants. He lingered for a moment, staring at them, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle into his bones. The grizzly was still out there. Maybe watching. Maybe continuing on its own journey just as he was. Cole didn't know if he would ever see it again. But deep in his heart he believed that in some way, in some unspoken way that went beyond words or reason, they would always remember each other. The drive home felt surreal. As the familiar roads wound back toward civilization, Cole found himself caught between two worlds, the untamed wilderness he had just left behind, and the structured, predictable life that waited for him. The mountains faded in his rearview mirror, but the experience clung to him, settling deep in his chest like an old song that refused to be forgotten. Back in his small apartment, surrounded by walls instead of trees, he felt an emptiness he couldn't quite place. The sounds of traffic, the artificial hum of city life, it all felt distant, muted, as if his senses were still attuned to something wilder, something more real. He had gone into the mountains expecting solitude, adventure, maybe even a test of his survival skills. Instead, he had walked away with something he hadn't known he was searching for. The grizzly wouldn't leave his mind. Late at night, he found himself searching online for anything that could explain what had happened. Stories of grizzlies interacting with humans weren't uncommon. There were countless reports of people surviving grizzly encounters by staying calm or using deterrence. But he wasn't looking for survival tactics. He was looking for something deeper. Then, buried in obscure wildlife studies and personal accounts, he started finding them. Stories about grizzlies remembering acts of kindness, cases of hikers offering food to a starving animal only to be left unharmed in return. Tales of old hunters who, after years in the wilderness, swore that certain grizzlies recognized them not as threats, but as something else. A presence, a familiarity, a connection that defied the rigid lines humans so often placed between themselves and the wild. He read about Karelian grizzly dogs, used by conservationists to teach grizzlies to avoid humans, and how some grizzlies remembered specific handlers even years later. He found a case of a man in Siberia who had fed an orphaned grizzly cub, and years later, the fully grown grizzly had reportedly returned, watching him from a distance but never approaching. The patterns were rare, but they were there. Cole leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Could that really be what had happened? Had the grizzly known him, remembered him? Logic told him no. Science suggested that grizzlies, while intelligent, were still wild creatures governed by instinct. But something deep in his gut refused to let go of the idea. He had seen the way the grizzly had looked at him before walking away. It hadn't been fear, nor was it the detached disinterest of an animal that simply moved on. It had felt like acknowledgement. Weeks passed, but the memory refused to fade. If anything, it became sharper, more significant. He carried it with him in the small, quiet moments of his day, when he sipped his morning coffee, when he walked home from work beneath a grey sky, when he stood by his window at night, staring at the sliver of moon above the city. One evening, as he sat watching the sun dip below the skyline, he made his decision. He had to go back. Not permanently, not to stay, but he needed to return to that place, if only to see to stand where it had happened, to breathe the same air, to remind himself that it had been real. A week later, he was driving back toward the mountains, his pack resting in the passenger seat. The roads were familiar, winding through valleys that stretched endlessly in golden hues. The sky felt wider out here, the air cleaner, untouched by the weight of city life. He reached the trailhead by midday and started the hike, retracing his steps along the rugged path. The deeper he went, the more the world around him changed. Phone's signal faded. The sounds of civilization melted away, replaced by the rhythmic pulse of nature. Birds overhead, the distant rustle of something moving through the underbrush. When he reached the riverbank, he stopped. The place looked just as he remembered it, the same smooth stones, the same gentle current flowing past. The tree where he had pitched his tent still stood tall, its branches swaying in the wind. He set his pack down and crouched by the water's edge, running his fingers through the cool stream. He didn't expect the grizzly to appear. He wasn't even sure if he wanted it to. What were the odds anyway? The wilderness was vast, and a grizzly's territory stretched for miles. It could be anywhere. It might have already moved on, living its life as it always had. That was the way of nature. Nothing stayed in one place for long. But still, he reached into his pack and pulled out a small handful of berries. Not much, just enough to leave behind. A quiet gesture, nothing more. He set them carefully on a flat rock near the water, then sat back, watching as the wind rustled the grass around him. For a long time, he stayed like that, just listening. And then, as he stood to leave, his eyes caught something in the dirt a few feet away. Tracks. Large, fresh, leading from the trees down toward the water. His breath caught as he followed them with his gaze, tracing their path until they vanished into the undergrowth. He hadn't noticed them when he arrived. The grizzly had been here. Recently. A slow smile spread across his face, and he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He didn't need to see it again. This was enough. Proof, in its own way, that the grizzly was still out there, still roaming, still thriving, still part of the land that had brought them together in the first place. He hoisted his pack onto his shoulders and took one last look at the riverbank. The mountains loomed beyond it, their peaks stretching toward the sky, vast and unyielding. Maybe he would never see the grizzly again. Or maybe, just maybe, it was watching from a distance, hidden among the trees. Either way, he knew one thing for certain. Somewhere in the heart of the wilderness, a grizzly remembered.